Well, welcome everyone. I think most of you have met Robert McDermott, but for those of you who haven't, and which might include those of you watching now online, Robert McDermott is our esteemed colleague here in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. He's also a dear friend of many years, 29 years, I think. This year will be the 29th year since we first met, before we both realized we were going to become colleagues at California Institute of Integral Studies and have our lives and karma. Well, we realized fairly soon after that our karma in our lives would be intertwined, and probably have been for many lives before this one. I mentioned karma and other lives because the idea of karma and other lives, or continuity of lives, is a core ingredient in the thought of Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy, which is a living core element of Robert's life's work, which we'll hear more about today. One of the missions of Rudolf Steiner was to reintroduce the idea of karma and that sort of deep continuity of meaning through lives back into the Western worldview. So Robert has been doing that with his work on Steiner and anthroposophy, not only with karma, but many other dimensions that Steiner explored. Robert has been deepening into those areas in Steiner's work, but through his own life and making connections between the anthroposophical project and many other contemporary and historical trends, which you will have read from the excerpts from his wonderful book, Steiner and Kindred Spirits. So I won't delay, because we all want to hear you, but I'm so grateful to have you here today, Robert. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sean. I knew you'd think of something to say.
Well, it's just a fragment.
Right, great. Well, hello everybody, I'm happy to be here. I love this course because it's so PCC, really does us, you and faculty together. We didn't meet, I'm Robert. Well, I'm not allowed to leave. Well, behave. So glad you have some questions, and I will leave time for that. But I also am going to hit on a few topics. And I think that in the first half, I will do something from the preface, something from the introduction, and then we'll at least get into the 7th chapter, the one on God, evil, and suffering. It may spill over into the second half, but I want to save a good part of the second half for social justice, particularly the Gandhian tradition. So inspiring and inviting, and yet maybe not. It may not get your full assent. I don't know, we'll see. Okay, so have you read most of what you've been sent? Most of you have read most. Okay, I'm going to take that as a go-ahead. In the preface, most people don't read prefaces. I do, and I recommend that you do, because you get a sense for where the person's coming from. Who are there? Who belongs to that person? Who's his or her people? Right? That usually shows up in the preface. Also, something about the purpose. And in my preface, the purpose is quite sort of really sent out with a certain energy to it. Namely, I wrote this book so that the Steiner people will know about these companions that Steiner didn't know, and most followers of Steiner don't know, sadly. And I'm also signaling to the people who are enthusiastic about these kindred spirits, wait a minute, you forgot one. I know it's complicated and it's huge and it's maybe even questionable, but you really should know this. So those are the two perspectives of the book, and that goes through the whole book. So there's nobody in the book who I'm interested in demolishing or undermining or whatever else. And so it's a positive book in the sense that I'm recommending everybody in here for whatever purpose you're looking for. And it's kind of collegial, right? It says, Buber's terrific here. You should listen to him. He's really good. And then, yeah, and Steiner has something like that too. And it goes on like that through the whole book. You've read some part of it, but the other chapters are like the other chapters you didn't read are like the chapters that you did read. So one of the concepts that I introduce is numinous. This has to do with the aha, or it's a very a bit overwhelming, it's surprising, it's irreducible, it's mysterious, it's elevating, it has all those qualities that are associated with holy, mysterious, in a way that could make you grateful. Not really diminished, but in awe of some kind of vastness. It might be height, it might be depth, it might be just beyond, but that's in this book. That is to say, all the figures I'm talking about had some sense of something like that and have the ability to communicate it. So I didn't write about people who didn't write, right? I didn't, there were some people who are really important for their silence. But this is a book about words, ideas that can be expressed, and it's a Logos book. I hope it's also a Sophia book, but it's a Logos book in that it is about ideas that have been expressed, right? So that you can really think about what somebody is saying. And these are people who are good at saying what they think. I can't think of any that isn't a great writer. No, I don't think so. Okay, it's also a book about gifted people, as in they're graced. They seem to have some capacity that very few people have. It's sort of like, how does he know that? Or how does she think that? How did she see that? It's inspiring in that way. James says, William James, I quote William James a lot. William James says, when you want to know about religion, you call in the experts, which is what his Varieties of Religious Experience is about. It's about experts from, Moses or to Kierkegaard and Whitman and William James. He didn't know about Steiner. Actually, he didn't know about any of these. No, he didn't know about any of them. So time for new Varieties of Religious Experience, which is sort of what it is in a way, but not so much based on, well, he was mostly interested in sort of the conversion of the sick soul. He had a Protestant soul, right? I have a Catholic soul. I'm looking for the gradual. I'm not a Rinzai Zen, I'm a Soto Zen. I'm interested in the gradual process. And James is looking for sick, and then all of a sudden, the guy in the Harlem bar gives up the drink because he heard sweet Jesus speak to him. That's a great thing. But I'm more interested in sort of day in and day out. And these people I'm talking about are mostly day in and day out type people. Okay, and then if you read the preface, at the end, it says, I have very few, I have a lot of relatives, only one of whom ever read a single word about Steiner, and that's because he's the education professor at Stanford who was called to review a Waldorf school that was 98% black, and was it working for these kids? And so he read a little Steiner, which he didn't. Anyway, so it's not everybody's thing, but it's my thing, and I want you to get a look at it. Some people say, well, I love Waldorf, but I don't know about the rest. Or I love biodynamic, but I don't know about the rest. Or I love his idea of light, or heat, or something, or architecture, etc. Okay, So then the next chapter, which you, I hope, read, is about the chapters, and who's in them and why. And so it, I could even, it only took about a minute, I could do that. I hadn't planned to do it, but I could, couldn't I? Yeah. So it's, why do I have Emerson, James, and Royce? Because, among other things, Steiner was a philosopher. So I want you to see that there are some philosophies that are positive, that have, if not explicitly spiritual, they have an ability to serve as a foundation for a spiritual worldview. So that certainly includes Emerson, but also James, who really was in this great battle between Orthodox religion on one side, which he didn't subscribe to, and Orthodox science, which was actually, in some cases, even more dogmatic, and he was trying to steer a middle course. And Royce, who is my favorite philosopher among people who are only philosophers. In other words, Steiner is also a philosopher, but Royce is just a philosopher, and I think he's a really great one. And he had this great idea of the individual coming out of Emerson, the individual in relation to the absolute or the something total, some complete reality. So he's the one who created this phrase, the beloved community, which Martin Luther King learned about at Boston University because he studied with the students of Josiah Royce. Then I include Martin Buber because Buber's idea of I and thou is very similar to Steiner's idea of what of the sort of, I just remembered a phrase, I hadn't thought of it in a long time, cor ad cor loquitur, the phrase of Cardinal Newman, which is heart speaking to heart. It's a great phrase. And Steiner says heart speaking to heart is actually a modern Eucharist, a way in which the divine sort of comes into matter, which is what the Eucharist is supposed to be about. Okay, I included Jung as the most obvious comparison. Jung and Steiner are these two absolutely enormous figures, both esoteric, especially Jung later in life, looking into the secrets of the unconscious that are not available easily. They are available, but not easily. Like Steiner, he's got access to Asian Buddhist wisdom, some yoga, but also alchemy, which they both do. They're both, in a certain sense, Gnostic, but Gnostic now I mean they're really, in some extent, on their own. They're on their own path, and they're originals. Now, of course, Jung is influenced by Freud, the way Steiner is influenced by Goethe and Blavatsky, but there's a way in which they are really singular. Before I called the book Steiner and Kindred Spirits, I called it Unique, Not Alone. This title's better, but you see what I mean by unique. He's unique, but yet there are others like him doing some of what he's doing. Then Teilhard de Chardin is an obvious comparative figure. He's evolutionary, deep Christian mysticism, a deep, profound love of the earth, of science. He was a world-class paleontologist. So that's really an exciting comparison. And then I include the Dalai Lama, who is, you know, I like to think, the foremost spiritual teacher on the planet today. Exquisite and seems to be faultless. All the people who could and spend a lot of time digging up scandals haven't hit pay dirt with him. I'm sure the Chinese would give millions to get somebody to show up and say, this is what he did. But he didn't, as far as we know. And then I have a chapter on Sophia, because it's the divine, especially in the West. All three Abrahamic religions, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, have a much too strong an investment in the masculine dimension of the divine, and the Sophia is the correction for that. And it's hard to say exactly the status, the exact location, it's not a location at all. It's a how, not a what, not a where, it's a what and a how, but not a where. So there's a chapter on that. And then I'm happy to say I have this chapter I absolutely love on Rabindranath Tagore. How many of you know that name? Rabindranath Tagore. How do you know that?
I've read him.
Good for you. Yes. Who else? Tagore, yeah. Most people haven't. Tagore was a early 20th century poet, dramatist. It was for his drama that he got the Nobel Prize in 1912. A great painter, a songwriter, a musician and a songwriter. One of his songs is the national anthem of India. The other one is, another song is the national anthem of Bangladesh. Pretty good for one life. He's a great, elegant, and vastly sophisticated person. Yeah. And I didn't appreciate him at all when I was younger, and I wrote a book with an Indian friend, and he was quoting Tagore in Bengali and translating, and I was a little bored. And now, because I love him. And our dear Devashish, who was the Haridas Chaudhuri professor, is the great nephew of Tagore. I know. That's lineage. And then Gandhi is really only in the chapter you read, and I hope you learned something from the Gandhi. More people know his name than actually know a lot about him. He's pretty interesting and very complicated. I hope you got that sense. This is complication, but inspiring. Then there's a chapter on education, Dewey, who is the single most influential thinker with respect to public education in the United States. The only trouble is it's very hard to be a Dewey teacher. And then Montessori, of course, there are Montessori schools everywhere, and not all of them are true to Montessori. I could talk a lot about that if you're interested, but not today. And a similar tension with Waldorf. People were devoted to keeping it pure, and other people, no, let's spread it all around, and people spread it around, you're going to lose something, and can you hold them together, and etc. It's all fascinating. And then there's a chapter on, it's called On Behalf of Gaia, which has Sean's 5 principles, principles of integral ecologies. And then it has a discussion, which I hope you'll read someday, about to what extent is it positive to introduce a spiritual dimension in the cause of ecology? Is it a distraction? Is it raising too big a context? Is it trying to know something you can't know and therefore not knowing what you need to know? All that. And maybe it's a little divisive, too close to religion, too close to dogma, stay away. But maybe that we won't really know what's happening and what to do without a deeper dimension, deeper, higher, more spiritual. That's why I get into this conversation about Thomas Berry and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard is pre-ecological in the sense that he didn't know about the catastrophe, but Thomas Berry, in a certain sense, I don't want to overstate this, but to some extent he abandoned Teilhard, maybe it's too strong a word. He stopped talking about Teilhard to some extent because he was eager to emphasize what we could share and not emphasize a French Catholic priest, and who was very deep into the relationship of Christ and the earth. So in a certain sense, Thomas became a kind of a Confucian, became a lot of things. That was one of the amazing things about him. So he was a Confucian and a Christian and a feminist and a shamanic person and a lot of good things. But the question that I raised in that chapter is how can we afford to be without this spiritual, esoteric, mystical dimension? And can we afford to include it, knowing that it divides and introduces more than we actually know? All right? So, then the last chapter is quite personal. It's about 4 spiritual paths or practices, traditions, communities in which I participate. The Hindu, in which I participate through my involvement with Sri Aurobindo. My good friend Devashish and I are frequently talking about Sri Aurobindo, and we're planning a course together on Sri Aurobindo sometime. We don't know when, but it will happen. And then in the Buddhist community, I have a spiritual relationship to the Dalai Lama. I think about him and I'm concerned for him and carry him in my mind and heart. So that's a spiritual relationship. And then for the Christian tradition, I'm close to several people, but closest to Teilhard de Chardin, because I love his mysticism, his science, his humility, his artistry. He's kind of an artist of living and friendships and many beautiful things. And then the 4th part is anthroposophy, that is to say the spiritual practice recommended by Rudolf Steiner, which has to do with, as he said in one of his last writings, anthroposophy is a path of knowledge, but he meant by knowledge which is filled with affection and will. So it's closer to love than to what we usually mean by knowledge. And it's a path to lead the spiritual in the individual to the spiritual in the universe. So it doesn't depend on a particular religion or a particular philosophy or a particular anything. Wherever, however you are, to get the deep you in relation to the depth or the height or the truth. Truth is actually a good word for that. The truth of the universe, the truth of sticks and stones, stars, babies and old people and starvation and hurricanes and etc. So that if you read the first chapter, you should have you should find what I just said familiar, because that's what that chapter does. And then there's the chapter on Steiner alone talks about, that's included, yeah, got confused for a minute. Steiner alone really talks about how sort of the sources behind him, which means Goethe, a natural philosopher, also, of course, a great artist, the author of Faust, and German idealism, particularly Schelling and Hegel, which is a big worldview, the I and reality of spirit, transformation of history. So he had a deep drink from both of those sources. Then they're not the same language, almost the same time, but different. Goethe is really close to the earth and has this very strong scientific side. And as Sean can tell you, Schelling and Hegel are just absolutely quintessential philosophers. I mean, just there. It is philosophy in its totality. I would even say in its purity. It's just so exquisitely creative from deep philosophical contemplation. So he comes from that. But he also comes from the Madame Blavatsky, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the Russian clairvoyant. That is to say, she could see clearly into things. She could see clearly into history, into spirits, into the afterlife. She was quite a complicated person. She sometimes did tricks, and then she also was badly served. She the Society for Psychical Research investigated and didn't do a good job and said she was a fraud. Some very sad parts to her life. And the gender was not, was a factor, seems to me. So and then he had this, he was influenced by Nietzsche, whom he visited, and he really had this sense of this amazing but tragic soul who really couldn't find peace in the world, and really suffered. He suffered mendacity. He suffered dishonesty in the culture. And then Steiner had an experience of what he called cosmic Christ, Christ in history, Christ in evolution, Christ in the cosmos, Christ sort of somehow involved in the depth and the sort of the truth of the earth and what the earth is able to nurture in terms of physical life, and then the vital, or what he calls the etheric, the living quality of the earth, and then also human souls, personalities, language, music, art, all those ways in which are feeling life, and then how the earth also, by making those three possible, then those three then evolve to the level at which they could receive spirit life, each individual soul, I was going to say each individual soul, but each individual soul is then sufficiently advanced to receive spirit, that is to say, my unique individuality, which requires my body and my emotional life and my mentality and my language and my curiosity and location. But that I, as Sean was saying earlier, that I, he says, has been here before, and goes into an appropriate sort of complex structure that, not structure is not a good word, complex sort of a being made of physical, feeling life, mental life, that can then receive the last element, the I, the spirit, that has multi-lives spread over a long period of time, and presumably that's not over, but it's underway sufficiently that when we get to know the physical, the etheric, the soul, and the I, we then have the possibility of having true knowledge of the human being. And you then also have, this is one of his most important points, you also then have a true image of the human being against which you can measure the deepest commitments of your culture. So you may be in a culture that is deeply devoted to the denial of, say, etheric life, feeling life, or soul life, right? The qualities, the creative capacity of language or music or rhythm, which is in the earth, it's in the cosmos, it's in the body, it's in music, all of that. He says you may be in a culture in which none of that is prized, and therefore not cultivated, and therefore you live sort of only a part of your life. And the culture then becomes more and more static and destructive. So you see, he has the foundation for quite a strong critique. All right. I can go on now to chapter 7, Good, Evil, and Suffering. What do you think, Sean? Should I take a few questions or keep going? I hate to put you on the spot.
It's up to you, and maybe...
Let me see. Do any of you have questions just like that? Go ahead.
Yeah. You said in your chapter that there is a really central role of Christ in the evolution of consciousness, and I didn't really understand. So can you elaborate a little bit more? Why
Sure.
is Christ so central to understand Steiner, in particular in the
Yeah.
evolution?
Well, one short, inadequate answer is because he thinks so. Because he says, that's what I experienced. I didn't make it up. But then how would we, say, justify that? He thinks that unlike history, which is on the conscious level, and we can see this event causes this event, it's maybe not obvious, but we all have access to it. We may argue about it, but we have access. All right, we don't have to be special to understand history. But to understand evolution of consciousness, you need some imagination, some intuition. You need to see what's behind that chain of events. You need to see not just what's visible, but what's causing, what's behind, and also what's luring, what's calling it all forward. And also, you see if there's something, anything above it that's kind of coming into it and moving it along, like the avatar in the Bhagavad Gita comes into the earth plane and moves it along. So the Buddha comes in and teaches selflessness and compassion, and etc., and moves along the whole history of the Asian world. So he says these beings, angels, archangels, avatars, bodhisattvas, saints, they are all part of a very full divine world pouring itself into human, earthly, cosmic, human, earthly and human change, growth toward according to Steiner, individuality and love. Now he says the most transformative such event is the incarnation of Christ, which is a divine being joined inextricably in a human personality. So he says this being, which was exquisitely prepared by a carefully chosen young Jewish woman, is the next step after Krishna and Buddha on behalf of the evolution of humanity. So it doesn't belong to Christianity. It belongs to humanity. So he thinks that's actually what happened, and of course, all incarnations come to a specific community. Krishna didn't come to the Jews, he came to the Indians, and Buddha came to the northeast India, to people who could hear him. So when he said, I'm going off into the woods to meditate, they knew what he was doing. They didn't arrest him, they didn't send him to an asylum. They said, yeah, in our culture, that's a good thing to do. So long as you take care of your wife and your child, you can do that. So it's called an extraordinary dharma. So he had to have that kind of cultural support. And then he had to go off into the woods where he met some people who were working with him. Turns out he left them behind in a way, because they couldn't do what he could do. But that was a nurturing time for those 7 years. So all of these great figures come into something specific. They come into, Bach didn't start music, and Mozart comes after Bach, and Beethoven comes after Mozart. They're in a culture, they're in a context which enables them to have something, have some people to receive what they're doing. So the way Krishna and Buddha came into an Indian culture, he says Christ came into a Jewish culture, but not only Jewish, also Greco-Roman Mediterranean culture, which was this like that, and so that's a kind of a rich. So he and what he was saying was standing on 2 feet or had 2 hands. One was this Jewish, which has to do with history, morality, providence, what Buber calls dialogue between human and divine. but also had this Greek and Roman sense of arche, of structure, of reality, ontology, all that, and order. So he says, of course, Christ came to only one young Jewish woman. So it's very limited. But then it's supposed to spread. It needs people to hear it. And some people heard it, and some people said, the guy's a loser. And other people said, no, actually he's not a loser. This is something else. This is really, this is something else. Somebody said, I don't think so. But then there's a big search and an argument and a rejection, etc. And that's where we are. Who can find something in that and who can't? And then all the opposition that comes in and sort of diminishes Jesus, the great multicultural, compassionate teacher, and gets used for various purposes. Same way with Krishna and Buddha and these figures all used too. But they're not, the stakes are not as high with them. So he thinks that Christ is is like what Jung says, that Christ is the archetypal eye. It's the eye of humanity. And it has to do with love and the Christian tradition, to some extent, has some sense of what he's about, and also a lot of misreading and misappropriation. So it's a big drama, really. But I'm glad you asked that question. That's a good. That's it. Right on time, right on target question. Right. Anything else that's hot like that? Yes, please. Joseph.
Yeah, Joseph. We have this consciousness and the evolution of consciousness, way before Buddha and Christ and everybody else. So how can we justify that?
Yeah, good question.
Simple question.
Yeah. Sri Aurobindo is very eager to show that there's an evolution of consciousness in the Upanishads. If that's true, I don't see it quite the way he does. But if it's true, it's not true the way we mean evolution of consciousness beginning with Hegel. This version of evolution of consciousness has to do with the four levels that I mentioned: physical, vital, mental, and then really the realm of spirit, and evolving to the point of self-consciousness. So now human beings, you don't even have to know Hegel, but it helps, but human beings who are awake to the evolution of consciousness can participate in the evolution of consciousness and direct it, move it, etc., in a way that I think is not affirmed prior to 19th century Europe. But it's arguable. It's arguable. But I think those few and the people who come after, and it's also helped by Darwin, so it's philosophical but also biological. It's also social and cultural in the sense that cultures like Marx, Marx is really important. Basically he's saying that institutions control human consciousness. So therefore we should improve our institutions because it's destroying people. Whereas Hegel was more on the side, not completely, but more on the side of it's consciousness that controls the institutions. I'm pretty sure they're both right. Like this, like this, like this, like this. I'll look at my friend Sean and see if I get a yes on that one. Okay, so it's a great question. Whether evolution of consciousness is a significantly new idea in 19th century European philosophy to sort of credit them with a change in consciousness. But if we go back to the Upanishads, I think we will see they're talking about the kind of change that you could almost predict will lead to Hegel.
May I ask you a quick question? So that consciousness that controls institutions, you're not talking about the human consciousness, right? You're talking about the cosmological consciousness.
Thank you. I'm talking about all consciousness, but very much intensified or focused or with an emphasis on the human, because the human has the knowledge, the will, and the affect to move it, and also to destroy it. So the earth, the cosmos, with Steiner you always say cosmos because he's talking about other planets working on this, all right, working with the earth on the evolution of humanity. And that, but once the cosmos, and particularly the earth, generates a species that's able to influence its origins and its future, then we're into a different game. And that's what they think is really important. Yeah. Okay, maybe I'll go to the chapter because there's lots to talk about with God's evil and suffering. Not for the first time, but it certainly is prominent at the present time. And then in a way I've chosen a sort of part one, part two, because the social justice is the response to the evil and suffering. Okay. Evil is here, now what do we do? And one of the answers is nonviolence. Okay, so this chapter I chose 3 figures. Some I choose only one, sometimes 2, sometimes 3. This I chose 2 because I was determined to get Martin Buber into the book. He doesn't have so much in common with Steiner, but he does. He is comparative to Steiner with respect to evil in relation to God. So that's a place where they touch. All right. And Jung is in the book several times, and clearly in this chapter he's clearly a major figure. All right. So how many of you have ever read the book of Job? No, it's not so surprising. People haven't read those things. But let me treat you. Treat yourself to a reading of the book of Job. It's tremendously confusing. It's mysterious, a little frustrating. So Job is a good guy. He's a moral person. He obeys the rules. He's a good husband. He's a good father. He's a good shepherd. He's a good friend. All right, and he believes in God, and he believes that God is good. All right, and then, according to the story, God, who seems in this particular story a little insecure, has an argument with Satan, who says, you think you have such loyal followers, it wouldn't take much for Job to abandon you. And God says, oh, not Job. And Satan says, yeah, Job. Yeah, your guy Job looks, I know he's very faithful and all, but let me at him. And they have a little bet. It's embarrassing in a way for God to do this, but everybody has a weak spot, and this was God's. And so he bets with Satan, and Satan then dumps all this stuff on Job. Horrific. He's got boils under his feet, and he's got things under his nails, and his sheep die, and his wife dies. And it couldn't get worse. That's why people say, patience of Job. And he's trying to figure it out. And his friends come around and say, well, you must have done this wrong, you must have done that wrong. But actually, he hadn't done these things wrong. He was an upstanding person. Okay. So it's very confusing and upsetting. And some of you might be right this minute able to think of some people who are really, really good, but get it in the neck in a way that, and some people who are not good seem to get the first prize. So what's going on, God? And Job is really suffering, and his friends are confused. And to make a short story, because when I did do Job, we had to do Buber. And then basically he kind of hits the bottom, and he sort of says, I give up. I don't get it. I don't know what you're doing, God. This is really crazy. He doesn't stop believing in God, but he does stop believing that God is just at least in his case. And then that comes out of the whirlwind, right? Look for these metaphors. It could be a mountain, right? It could be a cave. In this case, it's a whirlwind. Out of the whirlwind comes this very godlike voice saying, "Oh, Job, were you there at the creation?" I don't remember. I didn't see you when I created the world. Were you right there next to me? Were you, or are you a human being? And Job then falls down and says, I repent in ashes in the presence of God, the creator of the world, where I'm just this little guy. And then he has this experience of God's saving grace so that he stops suffering, and he's sort of has this awareness that God is good, God does love him, and there's a kind of salvation. All right, not everything comes back, by the way. The wife doesn't come back. The sheep come back, as I recall, but not his wife. But it has a happy ending in the sense that God listens to him and gives him the ability to be in relationship. However, it doesn't say why God did this. At least that's what Buber says. So Buber finishes, and this is one of the great Jewish thinkers of the modern world, certainly of the 20th century, probably numero uno, all right? And he knows all these books in all the languages available. Okay, this is a really upscale religious philosopher, okay? And basically he says, I don't actually know. It has something to do with hope. It has something to do that God is personal. It has something to do with this is not a mechanical situation. Bad things happen to good people. And I trust that God knows what God is doing. That's as far as he can get. Maybe as far as anybody can get. I have a book of 13 essays on Job. They don't agree, believe me. Okay. So Buber then has at his disposal some really great religious philosophical insights, especially this beautiful combination of I and thou, and I and thou, I it. I and thou is I. The I is a little bit like Steiner's I, the really deep, irreducible I, in relation to you. And he's mostly talking about persons. He has a place where he talks about I, thou with the tree, but that's not central to him. He's really talking about persons. So I can become an I by affirming you as an I. If I affirm you as an irreducible mystery with integrity, with your own individuality, so I'm not in any way organizing you, I'm not doing gender, I'm not doing race, I'm not doing class, I'm not doing economy, I'm not doing good voice, bad voice, I'm not doing any of those things. I'm affirming you in your exactness, what you are. Then he says, I, in that moment, become an I. If I don't do that and I treat you as an it, an object, you can give me money, you can do me a favor, you can pay me some sort of accord, all right? Then I'm treating you as an it. And even powerful people get treated like an it. Powerless people get treated like an it more often. And there's a whole thing with race, with gender, etc., all of which is very, very relevant. Okay. Now, with respect to God and suffering, which is the topic of the chapter, suffering, evil, and God, Buber says, I hold the God of Isaac, Abraham, and Jacob to be transcendent, personal, all wise, all good, all loving. How that relates to human suffering is not so clear, but human suffering doesn't make me chisel into that. So he's not making the Jamesian Whitehead move, which says that God can't be all-powerful or you wouldn't have such a terrible world. He says, no, God is all powerful, God is all good, and I don't understand well enough what I would like to understand. That's our job, to be in a world of trust, of hope, of dialogue, of relation. It's tricky, it's complicated, but that is the reality. We're not transcendent, God is. We're not all-knowing, God is. We're small, but we can have meaning in our life if we affirm and trust and love and in dialogue, person to person with God. It's one of those ideas that's not so comforting in the sense that it's not, cheap. It's got deep integrity. It says, no, this is it. This is where we are. We're human. God's not human. There's a chasm. But there's a dialogue between the two realms. So it's not smushed. It's not like, oh, I'm sort of God, or God is sort of human. No, that's not true. So he really holds his ground all the time, being in argument with people who are either making human divine or making God human. And he says, no, that's not actually true. All right, it's very deep, very honest. He has some beautiful, beautiful lines and ideas, and I really look to him for great integrity and, in the presence of God, great humility. All right? Okay, now Jung's Answer to Job, which is one of the favorite books of Sean and Rick, more than for me, but I think I understand it. Jung wrote whether an actual or something like a fever for 10 days, wrote pretty much nonstop this 160-page book. 110, yeah, thank you. A kind of an outpouring of something that had been building, right? Namely, an argument with Jewish and Christian thinkers who have basically opted for the Augustinian idea that that God is all good and evil begins after God, right? There's no evil in God. God creates the world, which includes evil, suffering, all kinds of things that are not God, but it come from God with a drop, which is what the myth of Genesis is trying to explain. Right? There was these human beings made this mistake. Okay, so Jung is impatient with this and says, I don't know how you can live with this idea of God being all good when, clearly right up to, there's the world that hasn't even started, and there's Satan in the garden going, psst, eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The purpose of the myth is that it shows that Satan is right there, if not the creation as close as you can be, and you can't get Satan if Satan doesn't come from God that's somewhat like Satan. There has to be some evil in God, at least enough to allow our suffering and our terrible deeds, terrible, which keep coming. All right, so we get rid of slavery, but then we get sex slaves, and we get rid of, we get some way to distribute economy, but then all of a sudden, all the small, tiny number of people get all the money. That keeps happening. So there's something really fundamental, and Jung says, look around. It didn't happen, somewhere along the line. It is good and evil all the way up, dark and light in God. Very powerful. It's Manichaean. It's, well.
With the Manichaean, there's two gods, God of light and the God of darkness.
Right.
Whereas Jung is saying there's one God.
That's true.
With contradictory sides.
Okay, that's true. Thank you. It's also true that ultimately there's good and evil. There's no all good and then God and then evil begins.
Right.
In that sense, it is dualistic. I think I'd say it's dualistic.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah.
Well, Manichaean is dualistic.
Dual. Yeah, I think it's
Certainly dual. Yeah. Okay.
It's
Good.
a polar dualism, but not, yeah.
Yeah.
Not
Sean knows
dualistic.
a lot about Manichaean. You got to be careful. Okay. So he knows other things too. Okay. How much will we do? So then, so those are big alternatives, and they miss each other completely. They had letters back and forth to each other, and Jung is basically saying, I'll start with Buber. Buber is saying, Jung, you think that psyche, that human beings create God. No. God creates psyche. God creates everything. There's nothing outside of God. All right? And Jung says, yeah, but you're not following. I'm saying everything is psyche, including God, because I've already told you that everything, God, psyche includes everything. So then he says, no, you're putting psyche first and God second. Jung says, no, actually I'm not. God is in psyche, infinitely, eternally, and so is everything else, and it's all about conscious and unconscious, all right, and the mix, and trying to get to the point where we, as human beings, have a sufficient relationship to the unconscious that we can find out where the divine works and how it works, all right? So they really do, the conversation breaks down, and Buber accuses Jung of basically having a philosophy or psychology that creates God, and Jung accuses Buber of not having sufficient imagination to get out of his theistic structure with God there, people here, and too big a divide between them. All right. Steiner is not influenced by Buber at all, which is sort of ridiculous. I've never seen a reference to Buber, even though there should have been. He is aware of Jung, but Jung writes the books that we in PCC pay a lot of attention to long after Steiner has died. Steiner dies in 1925, and Answer to Joe is 51? 55, 51. It's okay. It's in the 50s, which is 25 years, the whole generation after Steiner has died. So it would be hard for Steiner to know a lot about the Jung that sort of we get excited about here in this program. But I sort of blame Jung a little bit that he pretty arrogantly dismissed Steiner. He basically said of Steiner what Freud said about him. Oh, he just makes it up. He doesn't really know anything, which is kind of funny because Jung is all the time accused of making up all the stuff about symbols and archetypes and whatever else, and so, okay, you get the picture. But I don't want to diminish either. These are two of the wisest figures that we have access to. Sean and I do a course called Steiner and Jung. We kind of outdo each other, enjoying the other one. I'm enjoying Jung and he's enjoying Steiner. Okay, so I think we should take questions. So we got the introduction and chapter 7, God, Evil, and Suffering, and let's save everything about social justice till the second half, which is quite a hard topic. What do we do about this? You know, how much pacifism can we afford, and how can we live without it? Back and forth, back and forth. Okay, so questions? Comments, objections?
I have a question.
Yes.
So my question sort of revolves around anthroposophy. Did I pronounce it correctly?
Yeah.
And,
it's like anthropology, except instead of logi, which means knowledge, it's Sophia, which means divine feminine. So it's the combination of anthropos, human, and Sophia, divine feminine.
Wisdom, literally.
Sorry, divine wisdom. Thank you. So go ahead.
Okay. My question sort of relates to your own life, and that I'm curious as to how practically in your life, through practice or some sort of discipline, what has been your experience of experiencing the kind of epistemology that Steiner was hoping for, that almost sort of resembles art and science come together. So yeah, just curious about that.
That's too good a question. Not the wrong question, just, it's absolutely core and fundamental. Well done. Did you have any knowledge of Steiner before this?
Well, I audited Matt's course last semester, and he included some excerpts from it. Yeah.
Because it's a very good question. Just write all the right parts. Okay, so Steiner gave probably hundreds of suggestions for spiritual practice. Some of them he repeated again and again, some only once. Some of them have to do with art, some with movement, like eurythmy, right, which is trying to activate the etheric body. Some of them have to do with social life and listening and speaking. Some have to do with money and keeping money in movement, which is a spiritual activity. So you don't like this out of fear, but you keep money going. Some of it has to do with education, listening to children and receiving them and enabling them to go off in freedom. Some of his exercises have to do with higher beings, trying to live in the presence of higher beings. Say, what is it like to affirm in your life the reality of an archangel? That's very unusual. People don't usually talk about that. They might say saint, but because it's a holy person who had a life, like they just had this, what did he have? Of Padre Pio, the Italian man who had bleeding in his palm and with the because of the stigmata. And so what did they bring? Some part of his body they brought to St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, and people would go and maybe touch something and get some contact with a transformed body, right? And then he talks quite a lot about being in a spiritual, esoteric, deep, a little bit secret, hard to know relationship with Krishna, who he says is the one who brings I consciousness into the Indian world. And it's also having some consciousness of, I'm doing the last chapter, by the way, right now. Also then having some relationship to Buddha, which you can get in the Buddhist world, and with Buddha texts, Buddha images, Buddha phrases, etc. And then he said, then I'll say for him that his own karma was to be born in Central Europe, actually in Croatia, and what you usually consider the Austrian Empire, and the spiritual being with the most powerful influence in that part of the world was Christ, which he did not have any relationship to as a young man at all. And he was looking and having sort of a crisis of not finding. He was a Catholic altar boy in his young youth. Then the priest hit the children to punish them, and his father took him out of the school. And so he was educated at home, which is a little surprising because I didn't think the father doesn't seem to be educated. But he was just a naturally gifted, brilliant young person. Anyway, so he came into a Christian, to a world where it was possible to find Christ, which he did at age 39. And then that became, I'm going back to this, getting your name, I know. Anyway, back to why he said, not because I happen to have been in a culture that has Christ, but because he had the experience of Christ being the major influence in the major arc of evolution, which is this European consciousness, which may be presumptuous, may be a bad idea, certainly not politically correct. Okay, so as a person influenced by Steiner, which I have been since age 35, but before that I never heard of him. I've been a professor at that point for 11 years. I've been around the world. I had Fulbright to India, all kinds of things. I'd never heard of Steiner, then I did. And so what has it been like? Well, it's heavily Christian for me. It has to do with Christ, but I have not given up my relationship to Sri Aurobindo or to Buddhism. And so I like the line of Sri Aurobindo, who also gives many exercises, but none emphasized in any exclusive way. He says, all life is yoga. I say, all life is a secret yoga. And I hold the view that all life for me is anthroposophical. That is to say, every day, all day, I'm trying to make a relationship between my interior and the interior of the universe, which means your interior, which means the interior of the school, the interior of the city, the interior of the country, always the inner reality. But of course, being born in a rather superficial, materialistic culture, I am better at seeing surfaces than seeing depth. So it takes an effort, right? Some people can see depth, just he did. But I don't have that capacity, so I have to try to see depth. And that for me is anthroposophy, in thinking, feeling, and willing. So I try to think deeply, I try to feel deeply, and I try to act with a deliberateness, a deliberateness, I want to say, he says a free person is someone who starts a new chain of events. See, it's very close to Kant, but the new chain of events should be formulated by a knowledge of your interior I, that's tautological, your interior, that is to say your I, who you are in a multi-lived, long life way, not who you are in the moment by an impulse. So you see how Sean introduced, when he was introducing me, he said, I'm interested in karma, and I am. I'm very interested in trying to understand what am I and what are we here for? What's our purpose? What are we doing? Where are we going? What's it all going to come to? What will we have created? Not what we will have accepted. What will we have created by our will, influenced by our thinking, and characterized by love. So he wants those three together, thinking, feeling, and willing. And if you know the Bhagavad Gita, do you, Joseph? Do you? No. Do you know the Bhagavad Gita? Yeah. So it's action, knowledge, and love, the same as he has, thinking, feeling, and willing. Yeah. And not just each one in turn, but all three integrally, if I may say, integrally. There you go. That is to say, a thinking which is willed. You don't just think what occurs to you, but you think deliberately. And you think in a way that has love built into it. That's all very hard, but it seems to me to be quite a good teaching and practice. Sean.
Thank you for that. It was wonderful. I love the way you allowed me and I think us to see the essence of the spiritual practice in terms of both the three dimensions, thinking, feeling, and loving or willing, but also the essence of the esoteric perspective, trying to see below the surface of things. Thank you for that. I was wondering if you could just say a few words about a particular manifestation of that I know is important for you and that we share, but that you have also helped me strengthen in myself, and that is the relationship to the dead, so-called.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting sort of intersection point with the Confucian worldview too, for instance, and shamanic, where the ancestors are so present.
Right. Thank you. Great question. So, I didn't pay much attention to the dead. I can remember so many things that I care about now that I didn't care about previously. I definitely did not care about the dead. I was young, I was busy, you know, my parents hadn't died. I was okay. But then I started to read, well, interestingly, when I edited The Essential Aurobindo in 1974, I didn't pay very much attention to karma and rebirth. I included a chapter because I knew it was important to him, but it didn't mean much to me. And then the publisher friend wanted to bring out a new edition, and so I wrote an afterword, which has a lot about karma and rebirth, which of course was not the influence of Sri Aurobindo, but the influence of Steiner. Okay, so I could see that I was getting a new category or a new concern. And then as I continued to read in Steiner, which he treats the dead, the so-called dead, the afterlife, karma, I began to get quite a large picture, so that now I have it all the time. And the picture is that we were born to a more or less appropriate circumstance. Unlike lots of people who read Steiner and Aurobindo, I personally do not believe that where we land is guaranteed to be accurate. There are lots of, I know the angels are busy and good and powerful, but no number of angels could arrange for everybody to be born to the right parents, my opinion. Nor could all the angels in the world arrange for the right number of people to go down in 9/11 or from American drones in Syria or Afghanistan, etc. There's a lot of accident or unpredictability, all right? Given that, I nevertheless believe that lots and lots and lots of our life, our circumstances, our possibilities, including our physical suffering and impediments and Down syndrome and etc. Are karmically important. I'm not assuming that I know the interpretation. I do assume that it's important to try to find out what it is that we're here for, why do we have what we have to work with, and how, if we pay attention, would it make a difference? I believe it'll make a fundamental difference to know what we're here for when we try to decide who we should live with. How much money do we need? How much education do we need? Should we stay where we are? Should we change our career? Should we do all those fundamental decisions? I believe should be a subset of what am I here for? Now, you might be here for another person, and you might be here for that person and the children. You might be here for the children and not for the person. You might be here for some of the children, not for the other children. That also happens, that a person could get the feeling, is this child mine? And the child could get the feeling, that I have been born to them? And other times people really know, yes, this is who I am. And these people around me make, in some significant way, who I am. So this for me is a task. It's a meditative task. So in the chapter on spiritual practice, I include the discipline of trying to understand my task multi-lived. Now you can go to a psychic as I did a long time ago, who said, well, you were such and such, and et cetera, et cetera. And that might be true, and I don't know. But I'd rather find out myself what I should be doing. So I've been a professor for over 50 years. Was that right for me? I think I would have gotten a signal if it wasn't. Right? And I'm married to the same person for 52 years. Would I have gotten a signal? I think I would have. But other parts, I don't know. But I'm trying to find out. It's very hard to know your karma. You can do it retrospectively. You could say, yeah, this all makes sense. I should have been with that person. I should have had those children. I should have had that job. Or I don't know what in the hell I was thinking. Why did I waste 20 years doing that? It's very hard to do it prospectively. Retrospectively, it's easier. But I don't think it's impossible. And whether, even if it's very, very difficult, or maybe even impossible, I believe it is a spiritually efficacious task to know really what should we do with our time, with our relations. A lot of people spending a lot of time making money they don't need, can't spend. So it's not about that. So what is it about? The other day, when you were talking about people making too much money, whenever I hear that, I always say, it's not about money. It's they've got a demon for competition, which they can't stop. And if it weren't about money, it would be votes, or it would be, some other activity, right? So money is just an instrument, the way knowledge is. All right, it's something we can use to, sort of be somebody. All right, so it could have been a contender. Okay.
Oh, sorry, but you didn't get to the dead.
Oh, the dead. Sorry. I wasn't trying to avoid it, honest. Okay, so the dead. So all the dead in my life have had the same journey, and if they're really in my life, say a parent, both of my parents are deceased, then I have had a karmic relationship with them, and that is part of me, but I'm also part of them. And so they have gone on a spiritual journey where I think there are angels and spirits and etc. At night I say a prayer. I don't say it for my parents any longer, but I say it for my friend from when I was 3 and he was 2. And it says, this is my friend Chuck. And then I say, I know I believe you're now surrounded by angels and a lot of spirits. Have you found your mother who loved you with a mother's love? Have you found your brother who you cared for? I hope you're okay. And I say, and if you can send me some signals about you or his daughter who has cancer, right, or his widow who I love, I'm going to try to hear. I don't know if I've heard anything, but I believe he has heard. All right, I'm not the best hearer, but some other people are good hearers. So I believe that he, who died of ALS, is in the spiritual world, still connected, but I think he won't be connected to Earth forever. I think it's a journey, and he goes off, and then Steiner has this beautiful phrase, what he calls the cosmic midnight hour, which is when the soul has, the physical has already transmitted itself to the etheric when it dies, right? The etheric hovers for 3 days, which is why in traditional cultures there's a being with the body for 3 days, right? The Irish still do that. And then that etheric body, the envelope, transmits itself to the soul, to my personality, my language, my history, my etc. And then that principle, which is the only one left at this point, right, spends a third of its lifetime, so if it lived 90, it spends 30 years, according to Steiner, transmitting itself to the I. All right? Transmits all the love, this is Dante, right? Transmits all the love, all the fear, all the creativity to the I, which then is an I that is a whole lifetime richer, more than it was prior. Now that person might have spent a life torturing people. There are prison guards. They just sentenced a guy for 30 years for kicking in the head of a prisoner on Rikers Island. He was a sick man. He was on the floor. And the guard kicked him until he was dead. Now, when he finally does his 30 years, he then has to confront that. I'm fascinated by 9/11 when the 21 people meet the 2,470. What do they have in common? So all these things, Jung says the same. Nothing is lost. Nothing is sort of dissolved. All the thoughts, all the kindness, the dollar for the smelly person on the street, the kindness to the 2-year-old who's also smelly in the pants, and the person who talks too much and is really, 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 really boring, all of that is saved. And it becomes part of the I that I am in the next realm, in the next getting ready. Then he says the cosmic midnight hour is when the I has absorbed everything essential. Not every word, every jot and tittle, but everything essential has come into that I. And then it begins, and all of this is guided by other beings, by angels and archangels, and I don't think archangels care about us. They might care about Nelson Mandela, but I don't think they care about us. But maybe a little angel does, but not an archangel, right? Which then begins to guide the soul for another incarnation. Now the Tibetans think that this happens almost instantly, but I love the Tibetans, and I love that they are so wise about the afterlife. But Steiner says, no, it doesn't. It takes a long time for an I to absorb a whole lifetime. The Dalai Lama comes back, but he's special, very special. But the rest of us presumably have to go through a big absorption. But then if we absorb mostly negative experiences, not suffering, I mean cruelty, then that's the I, and that comes back. And sometimes we wonder, how did this kid get to be so nasty? How did this person grow up to be that job where you torture people? How did that happen? Well, if Steiner is right about karma, that person came looking for that job. That's what that I is. And it will do that lifetime after lifetime unless some group of people can help it develop the loving capacity to overcome the previous life. So nobody starts from scratch. We bring our previous lives, but particularly the last life, with us in essence, and as we're guided, we are looking for a culture, a parents, a language, a socioeconomic class where we can do what is our next task to do. Might be a musician. Going to quit, but break. But I want to give you an example of a for life that is not like us, but it's kind of an interesting as an example. The Steiner talks about. He says that Elijah was a very great figure in the Jewish, in the history of Jewish revelation. Okay, and he went to heaven in a flaming chariot. So he didn't die like everybody else. Well, whatever. That's a metaphor. But it doesn't mean nothing. It means that he was not like anybody else. It means at least that much, maybe more. Okay. Steiner says he came back as another exceptional person, John the Baptist, the one who was able to recognize that Jesus was not just another Jewish boy, but who was a Jewish boy with some vast destiny. Then he says, That, in fact, is a time when Jesus says, "Who do they say that I am?" And the disciples say, they think maybe you're John the Baptist, because John the Baptist was beheaded, all right? But also he was a great mystical, esoteric figure, okay, because he recognized Jesus. And in fact, when Jesus goes to get baptized, he goes to John and says, "Oh, I couldn't do that." And he says, "Yes, you could." And then according to the scripture, the heavens opened and it says, "This is my beloved son." All right. Not everybody could hear that, but presumably Jesus and John heard that. So then Steiner says that same huge soul with these two huge lives, maybe there were others, but Steiner doesn't say that. He says, came back as Raphael, the painter of the Madonnas and the child in a way that fuses the spiritual and the physical in an absolutely perfect composition. Right? This is the Raphael Madonnas they are sublime. Right now, so Steiner has a whole set of lectures just on Raphael's Madonnas. He also chose some Raphael Madonnas as healing images for somebody who's sort of emotionally struggling, right? To look at these images one after in a certain sequence, right? And he says, now that figure came back as Novalis. Most of you don't know Novalis. You know Novalis. How'd that happen?
A quote, or just some poem or something that I forget which one it was.
Good
Yeah.
going. Not many people know Novalis. But Novalis was a mathematician, scientist, poet, mystic, philosopher.
Was it
D-
the "Until One Is Committed"?
A little louder?
"Until One Is Committed." Is that Novalis, or is that?
Until one is committed. I think that's Goethe. At least it's attributed to Goethe, I think. But maybe it's Novalis. But they were contemporaries.
On the break, Google.
Okay.
Anyway, Novalis was this astonishing figure who died at 29, had a Sophia figure,
It was 13 or something.
13, like Dante met Beatrice when she was 9 and never saw her again, but she led him up to the upper rings of heaven. Okay. Anyway, check on. So anyway, this Novalis is astonishing, but not too many people know about him. I don't know if this is true. I only know that he thinks that's how it works. So you don't come back as a mathematician doesn't necessarily come back as a mathematician, but comes back with the intuitive power. So if you're not a mathematician, then you'd be a poet or a painter or something. You'd bring a quality which is of the same capacity or the same depth and the same level. Okay, break now, and we come back, we'll do social justice. Gandhi.